What's a Christian anyway? This is one of those questions that tends to get you different answers depending who you ask. I like to think of the word in terms of two different perspectives that both make sense to me in their own way. This would be a kind of a sociocultural perspective, or what I think the word means within the language context of society and culture, as well as a more spiritual, I would use the word proto-textual perspective, and I'll explain what I mean by that. But this would be more of an insider take of the term based on what someone might see in the Christian scriptures. So for the rest of the video, I'd like to just take a minute and talk about what I mean by both of those terms, the latter of which I kind of made up, and then kind of how I see the term myself from both of those angles. First off, I think we can use the word Christian in a sociocultural sense to refer to a variety of people who trace their heritage back to Jesus, i.e. the Christ of Christian, Christian, trace their heritage back to Jesus or to his first century followers in some way or other. Makes sense to me to see Christian in a sociocultural sense as those who trace their heritage back to Jesus or to his first century followers. Now, certainly there are some limits to this. For example, I've often heard that in various cultures overseas, individuals might refer to mainstream Westerners, basically everybody, over here, as Christian. And in one sense, that's hard to argue because Western society certainly does trace its heritage through the Christian tradition, rather than, for example, through the Hindu tradition or the Mohammedan tradition. As an aside, of course, some would argue that they prefer to see their spiritual forebears as the Greek philosophers, for example, rather than the Christian thinkers. But the fact remains that the intellectual climate of our society, the intellectual climate that immediately preceded our current self-identified secularist tradition, it wasn't Greek polytheism that we grew out of, but Christian monotheism, along with a loosely Christian monotheism and with deism, things like that. And that's so much so that, some modern atheists will make the claim legitimately, and they'll say to a Christian, the difference between you and me is just that I happen to believe in one fewer gods than you, that kind of thing. But that said, sociologically speaking, that's not how we use the term here in the West. We usually reserve the term for those who consciously associate themselves with a tradition that traces its heritage back to Christ or early Christianity. So what usually comes to mind when we think Christian would be the three main streams: the Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, and Protestant church traditions, all of which are well represented in our population. Other groups that trace their heritage back to Jesus would be the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as the Mormons, those who practice New Age spirituality, and the Unitarian Church. One extremely influential representative of Christian thought was a 20th century pastor named Harry Fosdick, who has been referred to as the greatest preacher of the century. He was known for very emotionally charged convictions that Jesus isn't the Son of God and the Bible isn't the Word of God. In terms of the sociological angle on what Christian means, he would be classified as a Christian. So to circle back to where I started, this is when it becomes a little more plausible for outsiders, such as those overseas, to think that American and Western society might just as well be simplistically referred to as Christian. You might as well refer to us all as Christians, because calling oneself a Christian doesn't require any set of beliefs, such as the existence of an omnipotent God or the actuality of a miracle-working Jesus. In fact, for many Americans, it would be a very small leap to refer to oneself as a Christian in the broad sense, particularly if you believe in an ethic of goodwill and kindness toward others, you believe in the dignity of the individual, if you believe in the importance of doing right in every situation. It's important to remember that being linked to a religious tradition has nothing to do with believing in divine beings or supernatural acts, any more than having lunch plans would have something to do with your commitment to peanut butter. That said, for those who do find it unpalatable to trace their heritage back to Jesus in such a manner, it's definitely legitimate to instead classify oneself as a convert to another religion, such as a modernized form of Buddhism or a modernized form of one of the Greek traditions. Okay, well, I mentioned there were two ways that I personally can see the question. The first was the sociocultural way of looking at it. The second is what I refer to as the spiritual or the proto-textual way of thinking about it. And like I said, this is more of an insider perspective. What I mean by proto-textual perspective is a kind of most primary source material kind of sense, or a foundational sacred text kind of sense. In other words, from an insider's point of view, what might one gather about what a Christian would be based on the earliest primary sources? For most people who self-identify as a Christian, the Bible is usually regarded as either the source material or at least the most important source material for the explicitly Christian aspects of their beliefs or practices. So it's worth considering what the Bible as the primary Christian source material might have to say about what it means or what it would mean to be a Christian. First off, it's interesting to note the word Christian is actually not a particularly biblical word, in that it only occurs 3 times in the New Testament. If you do a computer search for the word using certain modern translations, you might find more than 3 hits for the word Christian, but those are cases in which the translator has added the word in order to make sentences flow better to readers, modern readers who use the word Christian all the time. So it's very easy to throw the word in to make things make more sense, but that doesn't mean that that's the word that would have been in the head of first century readers. And I would argue it certainly wasn't the word they would have had in mind. And if you feel like looking into this at all, the 3 references I'm referring to, the only 3 places in the New Testament where the word Christian is used are Acts 11:26, Acts 26:28, and 1 Peter 4:16. So it seems to have originally been a derogatory term assigned to the earlier followers of Jesus by their non-Jewish detractors. The Jews wouldn't have coined the term and used it to refer to them because the word Christ is a Greek translation of the Hebrew term Messiah. So for a Jew to call Jesus the Christ, or to call his followers Christians, i.e. the Messiah's people, to a Jew, that would be to represent Jesus as the promised Jewish king foretold in prophecy. So Jews wouldn't have coined the term. But to non-Jewish detractors, calling these people the Messiah people would have been a particular insult, because around that time there were other small movements that would rise up around other alleged messiahs, which they would try some kind of political overthrow attempt or make some kind of trouble, and they'd be quickly stamped out by the Romans. It's not until the 2nd century that Christians began to take the name for themselves. It could be suggested that this gradual acceptance of the term is kind of a logical outgrowth of the Apostle Peter's words in his letter in 1 Peter 4:16, which I mentioned above, where he encourages believers who are suffering abuse under the name Christian. He encourages them to not be ashamed about it, but to glorify God in that name. So apparently, over time, Christians gradually came to embrace the word for themselves, which particularly makes sense since there's nothing fundamentally untrue about it. It's not like it's a word that etymologically means those lousy Christ followers. It just means the Jesus people, the Messiah people, the king followers, because Messiah basically means king or prince or somebody who's anointed in some way. So if the foundational sacred texts of Christianity and the teachings of the apostles out of which Christianity grew, if none of those use the word Christian, really, then what word did they use? How did they refer to one another? So it's generally agreed there were about 6 different terms in use in the 1st century. First one would be brethren, or brothers or sisters. Second one would be believers or the faithful, which are kind of 2 sides of the same thing. Third one is disciples or followers. Once again, same thing. Fourth one is saints, or the holy ones. And the 5th is the elect or chosen. They also referred to themselves as those who followed the way, which in a lot of modern translations, they'll put the way with a capital W, because that's the way it's being, pardon my pun, the way it's being used. And also in some of the New Testament documents, they would refer to others as those who are outside or outsiders, depending what translation you use, which suggests that the way they think of themselves is that they are those who are inside of something. Each of these terms refers to a different aspect of what it meant for these early Christians to be part of this movement, whether a reference to your brotherhood or commonality with your spiritual compatriots, or whether a reference to your belief in and allegiance to Jesus. For the third option, disciple, your commitment to his teachings as a practitioner student. For the fourth one, the saints, your belief that you have been mystically purified and set apart because of Jesus. For the last one, the elect, your belief that God has chosen you for the metaphorical flock of Jesus. All these terms were used synonymously to refer to those who belonged to the way. While each of these terms could be discussed further to draw out more finely how the early Christians saw themselves and what it meant to be one of them, my point is that these terms that they used instead of the word Christian, these terms had a lot more specificity, and they didn't refer to a sociological category or to a cultural inheritance, but instead to something much more spiritual and mysterious, which can't be quantified in kind of mechanical, broad brush kind of sociocultural ways. To come toward a conclusion, these are some of the reasons that I sometimes have a little trouble with the word Christian, depending who's saying it and what they mean by it, and particularly because of the uncertainty about what an individual might mean by it. I think it is a very useful sociocultural term to refer to one of the most influential ideological and sociocultural movements in all of history. Certainly useful to refer to that. And it makes sense in a certain way to allow anyone to use the term who has any felt connection of any kind or any loose ideological tie to Jesus. However, from the insider's point of view, the spiritual point of view, the looser kinds of things get to become more and more unhelpful, or they come to make the word more and more unhelpful. And I think that the original Christians felt that there was something really special they shared that can't be quantified with simplistic categories. So, if sometime this week you bump into someone at a social event and they ask you to tell them a little bit about yourself, feel free to throw in there that you're something of a Christian. And then where things are going to get meaningful, or where things are going to get interesting, is when one or the other of you begins to discuss together what that word means to you.